I stood frozen in the living room, the air thick with tension that seemed to compress every inch of space between us. Adrian, my stepson, stood just a few steps away, his eyes locked on me with a mixture of shock and something deeper, something I dared not name. I had just stepped out of the bathroom, a thin towel wrapped loosely around me, still damp from the shower. Every nerve in my body was on edge, my heart pounding in my chest so loudly I feared he could hear it. Adrian. I managed to stammer, my voice trembling with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. My hands gripped the edges of the towel tightly, as if it were my last line of defense against the moment unraveling in front of me. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes wide with a hint of something I couldn't quite place, lingered too long. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Adrian finally stuttered, his voice deep yet faltering. His face flushed a deep red, a stark contrast to the intensity of his gaze, a gaze that felt too heavy, too piercing. You should have knocked, I blurted out, my tone harsher than I intended as I tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. But my voice quivered, betraying the steadiness I so desperately sought. This was just a mistake, I told myself, a misunderstanding. Yet the way his eyes clung to me made the room feel smaller, the air denser. I'm sorry, he repeated softly, his tone laden with guilt, yet anchored by something unspoken. He didn't move. His hands hung by his sides, clenched into fists, as though he were fighting an internal battle I couldn't comprehend. I could feel the tension radiating from him, a tension that mirrored my own in ways I wasn't ready to confront. You should leave, I said quickly, my words clipped and strained. I wanted to sound firm, authoritative, but the quiver in my voice made me sound anything but. I couldn't let this moment linger. It was dangerous, too charged with emotions I couldn't allow myself to acknowledge. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might argue, might say something that would only deepen the already unbearable tension. But then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked softly behind him, and I was left alone in the deafening silence. I sank onto the couch, my hand still clutching the towel as if it were a lifeline. My breathing was shallow, my thoughts racing in a chaotic blur. What had just happened? It was nothing. Just an accident, I told myself. Yet the memory of his gaze lingered, vivid and unshakable. It wasn't the gaze of a boy who had stumbled into an awkward situation. There was something else there, something that unsettled me to my core. The rational part of me screamed that this was absurd, that I was overanalyzing a fleeting moment of embarrassment. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension that had crackled between us. It was electric, suffocating, and impossible to dismiss. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the room pressing in on me. The reality of what had transpired, or what I thought had transpired, loomed over me like a shadow. I knew something had shifted, something intangible but undeniable. And the most terrifying part was that I didn't know if I had the strength or the will to stop it from growing. After Adrian left the room, I remained motionless on the couch, my mind tangled like a ball of frayed thread. The way Adrian's eyes had lingered on me echoed relentlessly in my thoughts, stealing any semblance of calm I had left. I tried to reassure myself that it was nothing but an awkward accident. Yet deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Memories began to swirl, pulling me back to the day I first met Adrian. It was just a few months after Daniel and I had gotten married. Daniel, my steadfast and caring husband, often spoke with pride about his son from a previous marriage, a young man navigating his way through life after a series of personal struggles. I still vividly recall the evening when Daniel introduced Adrian during a cozy dinner at home. Adrian was just 19 then, a tall, confident young man with bright eyes and a disarming smile, though there was a hint of shyness about him. He entered the room with a mixture of self-assurance and hesitation, a balance typical of someone straddling the line between youth and adulthood. I had tried to make a good impression, aware that becoming a stepmother was never an easy role to step into. I wanted him to feel welcomed, part of this new family we were building together. But things didn't unfold as smoothly as I'd hoped. Adrian kept his distance, always maintaining an invisible boundary between us. Our conversations were brief and filled with an awkward politeness that left me feeling like an outsider. Daniel would often assure me that Adrian just needed time to adjust, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on their world. Over time, Adrian's presence in our lives became more consistent, especially after Daniel suggested he move back home to save money while attending a vocational training program. I didn't object, thinking it would strengthen their bond and help build a closer family dynamic. However, Adrian's return didn't bring the warmth or ease I had anticipated. Instead, it complicated everything in ways I hadn't foreseen. Adrian was no longer the bashful teenager I had met that first evening. He had grown into a confident and capable young man, exuding an unintentional magnetism. He fixed things around the house, took care of the garden when Daniel was away on business, and occasionally shared quiet conversations with me. These small moments, seemingly insignificant, began to linger in my mind. I found myself noticing Adrian more, paying attention to the way he carried himself, his easy smiles, and the thoughtful way he spoke about life. I remember one afternoon vividly. The coffee machine had stopped working, and I was struggling to figure out what was wrong. Adrian walked into the kitchen, observing my frustration with a curious look. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm and tinged with humor. I laughed and insisted I could manage, but he stepped forward anyway, gently taking the machine from my hands. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table as he tinkered with the device. Our conversation started casually, but it soon shifted into something more personal. Adrian opened up about his dreams, the pressure he felt to live up to others' expectations, and the insecurities that weighed on him. For the first time I saw a vulnerable side to him, a young man striving to find his place in the world while battling self-doubt. It was in moments like these that I began to feel a subtle but undeniable shift in our relationship. Adrian was no longer just Daniel's son or a member of the household. He had become someone I confided in, someone who listened without judgment, a rare comfort I hadn't realized I craved. I told myself it was a platonic connection, rooted in mutual understanding and respect. But I was wrong. Looking back, I see how those moments blurred the boundaries between us, setting the stage for the tension that now consumed my life. After what had happened earlier that day, I could no longer deny what was brewing between us. The fleeting glances, the accidental touches, the unspoken tension whenever we were in the same room, all of it pointed to a connection that had crossed into forbidden territory. I felt trapped between guilt and longing, knowing I had let something grow that should never have been allowed to take root. I sat in the quiet living room, my thoughts spiraling into a storm of regret and confusion. How had things gotten this far? I asked myself, but the answer seemed buried beneath layers of emotions I didn't know how to untangle. A part of me knew I needed to end it immediately, to draw a hard line and never look back. But another part of me hesitated, unwilling to let go of something that had brought a flicker of vitality into my life. This inner conflict weighed heavily on me, leaving me paralyzed in my own home. I knew there were no easy answers, no simple solutions to undo the tangled web we had created. And in that moment, as I sat alone, I realized that the path forward would be anything but clear. After that evening, everything seemed to fall into a limbo with no way out. The house, which had always been a place of peace for me, now felt suffocating. Every corner seemed to echo with memories and emotions I didn't know how to deal with. I knew that to save what was left I had to make a decision, one that would change both my life and Adrian's forever. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight seeped through the curtains, I had already been awake for hours. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cup of coffee in front of me but not drinking it. My mind was consumed by an endless whirlwind of thoughts. Adrian was still in the house, and I knew that if I didn't say something now, I would never gather the courage to do what needed to be done. I heard his footsteps coming down the hallway. When he entered the kitchen, our eyes met for a fleeting moment. He paused, looking at me. And I knew he felt the heavy tension between us two. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice barely audible but enough to break the silence. Adrian nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. The space between us felt both close and insurmountably distant. "Adrian," I began, my throat tightening. "I know things have gone too far. I've thought about this a lot, and I know we can't keep going like this." He remained silent, his hands clenched on the table, his gaze fixed on mine. "I knew this moment would come," he said, his voice low and hoarse but tinged with sadness. "But that doesn't make it any less painful." His words cut deep. I wanted to tell him I was sorry, that I never meant to hurt him. But those words felt meaningless compared to the gravity of what we were facing. "Adrian, I can't deny that I have feelings for you too," I said, my voice trembling. "But I love Daniel. And it's not just love. It's commitment. It's everything we've built together. I can't destroy that. And I can't keep hurting you either." He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world rested on them. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but resolute. "But you need to know, I've never felt this way about anyone else. You're the first person who's ever made me feel truly alive." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I fought to remain composed. "I feel the same way, Adrian. But that doesn't make this right. We don't belong to each other. And if we continue, we'll ruin everything, this family and ourselves." He didn't respond immediately, his silence stretching out like an unbridgeable chasm between us. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the emotions he was fighting to suppress. "I'll leave," he said after a long pause. "It's the best thing for everyone." My heart shattered. "Adrian, you don't have to do this." He interrupted me. "I can't stay here any longer," he said, his voice steady yet filled with anguish. "Every day I'm here, I feel like I'm tearing apart your life, Daniel's life, and even my own." Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't find the words to argue. Deep down I knew he was right. I knew that his leaving was the only way to restore some semblance of normalcy. But the thought of losing him felt unbearable. "You're an incredible person, Adrian," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "I hope you find the happiness you deserve." He stood up, his eyes filled with sorrow but also determination. "I hope you do too," he replied before turning and walking out of the room. I didn't follow him. I sat there, listening to the sound of the door closing, feeling the overwhelming pain in my chest. Yet, amidst the pain, there was also a sense of release, a feeling that no matter how hard it was, I had done the right thing. In the days that followed, I and Daniel began rebuilding our relationship. I tried to spend more time with him, cherishing the small moments I had once taken for granted. I realized that love wasn't just about intense emotions but about choices and the commitment to preserve what truly mattered. Adrian left and I never saw him again. But the memory of him lingered, a constant reminder of the mistakes I had made and the lessons I had learned. Life isn't perfect, but I knew I had chosen the right path, the only path that allowed me to make peace with myself. After that fateful day, the atmosphere in the house felt irrevocably altered, as if an unspoken tension had crept into every corner, tainting the once peaceful space. Adrian continued with his usual tasks, fixing things around the house, tending to the garden and joining Daniel and me for dinners. But between him and me, an invisible wall had risen. It was a barrier built on unspoken emotions and carefully avoided glances, yet its weight was undeniable. I tried my best to avoid Adrian's gaze whenever we found ourselves in the same room, but sometimes, when I wasn't quick enough, our eyes would meet, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the world stood still. His eyes held so much sadness, internal conflict, and something deeper that I dared not name. I knew I needed to maintain distance, to stop whatever was brewing before it spiraled further out of control. Yet his presence, both distant and intimate, left me feeling disoriented and vulnerable. One morning, as I sat at the dining table with a steaming cup of coffee and a book in hand, Adrian walked into the room. He was wearing a crisp white shirt I hadn't seen before, and it made him look more mature, more composed. I couldn't help but notice. But when he glanced my way, I quickly turned my attention back to the book, feeling as though I'd been caught in the act. "You didn't have to get up so early," he said, breaking the silence. "I was planning to fix the barn door today, it's been sticking lately." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the pages before me. "Thank you, Adrian. I'm sure Daniel will be happy to see everything in order." He lingered in silence for a moment before pulling out a chair across from me. "You look tired. Is everything okay?" His voice was gentle, filled with concern, and that made me feel even more uneasy. "It's nothing really, just been a busy week," I replied, trying to keep my tone light and casual. But I knew his gaze was piercing through me, uncovering things I was desperately trying to keep buried. "Don't lie to me," Adrian said, his voice low but without judgment. "You know I'm here if you need someone to talk to." His words cut through the walls I had painstakingly built. I wanted to say something, anything, but the truth was, I didn't know how to share my thoughts with Adrian without unraveling everything. In the days that followed, Adrian seemed to deliberately keep his distance. He spoke less, smiled less, and only interacted when absolutely necessary. I thought this would bring relief, but instead it left a void. I felt strangely adrift, as though I'd lost something essential. The silence between us only made the weight of what had transpired more unbearable. One evening, with Daniel away on a business trip, I found myself sitting alone in the dimly lit living room. The soft glow of the lamp cast long shadows on the walls, but even the comforting hum of the television couldn't distract me. My mind was replaying moments with Adrian, his eyes, his voice, and the strange pull I felt whenever he was near. I didn't realize Adrian was standing in the doorway until his voice broke the quiet. "You're not sleeping." Startled, I turned to see him there, his hair slightly tousled, his expression a mixture of concern and hesitation. "No," I said, fumbling for composure. "I just couldn't sleep." "Me neither," he said, stepping into the room and sitting in the chair opposite me. "Do you want to talk?" I hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I think we need to." Adrian didn't respond right away. He studied me for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "Do you think I don't notice?" he said finally, his voice low and rough. "I feel it. And I know you feel it too." My heart raced wildly. "Adrian, we can't." I began, but he interrupted me. "I know. But that doesn't change how I feel." He looked down, his hands clenched tightly as though he was trying to hold himself together. "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't pretend everything is normal." I met his gaze, and the pain in his eyes mirrored the turmoil inside me. I knew I had to end this, to draw a line that could never be crossed again. But the emotions swirling inside me were overpowering, stronger than anything I had ever felt before. "Adrian, I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I should have stopped this before it got this far. We need to keep our distance." He held my gaze, his eyes filled with anguish. "If that's what you want, I'll respect it. But you should know, I've never felt this way about anyone else." His words shattered something deep within me. Tears welled in my eyes, and I turned away, unable to let him see the cracks in my resolve. "I don't want to hurt you," I whispered. But this will destroy everything. Adrian didn't argue. He stood slowly, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. Without another glance, he walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the suffocating silence. I knew then that the dynamic between us had been irrevocably altered. But I also knew I couldn't let it go any further. No matter how painful, I had to find a way to preserve what little remained of the life I'd built. Because some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. After that night, everything seemed suspended in an unspoken tension, a limbo where the house I once found solace in became suffocatingly heavy, with unprocessed emotions and memories. I knew that to salvage what remained of my life, I had to make a choice. A choice that would irrevocably alter both my life and Adrian's forever. That morning, long before the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in front of me but never taking a sip. My thoughts swirled chaotically, and my heart ached under the weight of what I knew had to be done. Adrian was still in the house, and if I didn't speak now, I feared I would never summon the courage to do what was necessary. I heard the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, slow and measured. When Adrian entered the kitchen, his eyes met mine briefly, and in that fleeting moment, I knew he felt the same heavy air between us. He paused, watching me, hesitant yet expectant. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice soft but resolute enough to break the silence. Adrian nodded and pulled out a chair, sitting across from me. The space between us felt simultaneously intimate and impossibly distant. "Adrian," I began, my throat tightening with each word. "I've thought a lot about everything, about us, and I know that this can't continue." He stayed silent, his hands clenched into fists on the table, his eyes never leaving mine. "I knew this was coming," he finally said, his voice low and rough, carrying a deep sadness. "But knowing doesn't make it any less painful." His words cut through me like a blade. I wanted to tell him how sorry I was, how much I regretted letting things get this far. But those words felt insignificant, hollow compared to the gravity of what lay between us. "Adrian," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't deny that I feel something for you. But I love Daniel. It's not just love. It's a commitment, a life we've built together. I can't destroy that. And I don't want to hurt you any more than I already have." He lowered his head, his broad shoulders slumping under the weight of my words. "I understand," he murmured, his voice barely audible yet steady. "But you have to know, I've never felt this way about anyone else. You're the first person who's made me feel truly alive." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced myself to stay composed. "I feel the same, Adrian," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But that doesn't make this right. We don't belong together. If we continue, we'll destroy everything, our family, and ourselves." The silence that followed was suffocating, a void neither of us knew how to fill. He looked at me, his eyes brimming with pain and unspoken emotions. I knew he understood, but understanding didn't make it easier. "I'll leave," he finally said, his voice firm despite the sorrow etched in every word. "It's the best thing for everyone." My heart shattered as I looked at him, knowing this was the only way forward. "I'll always wish the best for you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You're an incredible person, Adrian. And I hope you find the happiness you deserve." He stood up, his eyes heavy with grief, but also determination. "I hope you do too," he said quietly, before turning and walking out of the room. I didn't follow him. I couldn't. I sat there, frozen, as I heard the sound of the front door closing behind him. The silence that followed was deafening, the finality of his departure pressing down on me like a weight I could hardly bear. And yet, amidst the overwhelming pain, there was also a sense of release, a faint glimmer of relief that, as difficult as it was, I had done the right thing. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Daniel. We spent more time together, rediscovering the small joys of shared moments that I had once taken for granted. I poured my energy into nurturing the bond we had built, knowing that love wasn't just about fleeting passion, but about the choices and commitments that endured. Through hardship, Adrian was gone, and I never saw him again. Yet his memory lingered, a quiet reminder of the mistakes I had made and the lessons I had learned. I carried those memories with me, not as a burden, but as a testament to my growth. Life isn't perfect, and neither am I, but I've come to understand that what matters most is the path we choose to take in the face of our flaws. And I chose to stay. I chose to fight for what I had, to learn from my missteps, and to cherish the love I had promised to protect. It wasn't easy, but it was right. And that, in the end, was all I could do.